The very first game that we're going to be looking at is going to be between Wesley So playing white against Gukesh with the black pieces. Going into the final round, half a point below the leader, Gukesh wants to win with the black pieces, but of course is also satisfied making a draw, since he's playing Wesley So with the black pieces. The game started off with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, and Nimzo Indian, e3, castles, bishop d3. We have seen this variation throughout the tournament, especially with Gukesh playing with the white pieces, so he's very familiar with it. Also playing with the black pieces. Both sides were developing their pieces. White is threatening bishop a3 in some positions, so black replied c5, a5, queen c7, ab, ab. Couple pieces were traded off in this game. And then, black has a relatively easy position to play. Therefore, Wesley So didn't really try too hard, and the game simply ended in a draw. So Gukesh was waiting for the result of the other games to see if he can make the playoffs or not. The next game we're going to be looking at is between Anish Giri playing with the white pieces against Fabiano Caruana. This was definitely the matchup of the round, since Anish has nothing really to play for, but Fabi needs to hold on with the black pieces, otherwise he will be forced to play a tiebreak. So the game starts off with d4, and then we had a Catalan with coming from Anish, so b6, castles, bishop b7, 8, b3, knight bd7, bishop b2, queen e7, a3, bishop drops back, knight went to h4, trying to prepare maybe the push e4 someday, or also go with ideas like b4 and c5. The pawn goes to g6, b4, threatening c5, black plays c5 himself, bc, bc, cd, ed, dc5, and then knight c5. Now black has this isolated pawn in the middle of the board, and the bishop is putting very good pressure, as well as the b2 bishop is staring at the king side. White goes knight b3, offering a trade. Knight jumps to e4. Knight goes to a5, attacking the bishop on b7 to loosen the d5 pawn. Rook b8. Queen to d4, threatening checkmate on two squares, which was guarded by the move f6. Knight takes b7. Queen takes b7, guarding this pawn on d5, as well as attacking the bishop on b2. Queen drops back to d1, since if black were to take on b2, which happened in the game, queen takes d5, and then, in this position, white is already up a pawn, and also a huge time advantage by Anish at this point. Fabi goes rook bd8, rook a2, attacking the queen on b2. Queen dropped to e5, offering a trade, which was accepted, and we have an endgame, which, technically, black should be able to hold with very correct defense, but Anish was up 30 minutes on the clock, and Fabi really needed to somehow hold this endgame in order to at least secure a spot at the top of the table in case someone ties with him to force the tiebreaks. So, bishop went to g2, f5, knight f3, bishop goes to f6, rook c2, attacking the knight on f6, knight e4, rook c1, controlling the c-file completely, and the pressure is actually building up for black. Knight goes to e1, very nice move, relocating the knight to d3, rook e7, and then the white pieces got rid of the bishop, so that now we don't have an opposite color bishop scenario at any point, and white is completely winning. And Anish Giri just played a very perfect game, and he almost ruined the tournament of Fabi at the very end. And of course, this was a very, very well-deserved win for Anish, although he wasn't really playing for anything on the standings. He at least finished at the 50% mark, which definitely improved his performance at the end. So, a very impressive win. Took completely outplayed Fabi in the final round, and did a very, very good job there. So, a big result, but Fabi was saved by Praggnanandhaa, as we're going to see very shortly. So in this next matchup, we're going to be looking at Praggnanandhaa playing with the white pieces against Alireza Firouzja. This was a very interesting game, since both sides technically wanted to win the game in order to at least catch up with the leader if Fabi made a draw, or try to clinch the event in case Fabi loses. So the game started off with a very sharp Sicilian Najdorf variation. Of course, I have to add that if Fabi won the game, then he would have won the tournament with clear first, but it's not easy, as we all know, to win with the black pieces at the end. So Pragst plays with the move bishop e2, and then here he plays this move h4, trying to start already a kingside attack. Pawn goes to h6, bishop e3, bishop e6, queen d3, and eventually we got a d5 break by Alireza Firouzja, and the long castle by Praggnanandhaa, offering the game into a very sharp territory. Black grabs the dog-squared bishop, having the bishop pair now. Queen goes to c7. Both sides are improving their pieces, and we have a very sharp position with both sides trying to really attack each other. And we see the battle of the two bishops versus the two knights, which is oftentimes favorable for the bishop pair, especially in open positions. E takes f4, g5, king to f8, queen f2, and black is up a pawn at this point. A very sharp position with both sides having 35 minutes on the clock, and here came this massive blunder, rook d to f1, attacking this pawn. However, it's not really easy to capture this pawn in reality, so rook went to g1, putting more support on this pawn. g6, queen f4, queen takes, rook takes, h takes g5, h takes g5, and then rook d4, exerting huge pressure on this pin, and it's very difficult for whites to even make a move at this point of the game. Rook went to f1, rook went down to h2, putting even more pressure. Ideas like rook g2 will be coming in, and this pawn will be lost at some point, so Pragg thought his only chance is to give up the exchange, and black is completely winning at this point. All he has to do is try to find the way to win the game. So they were both shuffling, and then we had some trades, and putting pressure here, and then picking up the pawn on f6, so it looked like this should be a very easy job for Firouzja, but now both players less than 3 minutes on the clock. Nerves are also coming into play, and it's not very easy for the f-pawn to go down the board, since white is still holding on and trying to have some counterplay by trading the pawns on the queen side. So one pair of pawns were traded, and maybe it was better for black to just take it this way, but Alireza did not want to go for that route, and it's very tough to evaluate. So he mostly lost his chances to win with the f-pawn, but the f-pawn was still sprinting. But nevertheless, Pragg did an insane job of defending and doing his best to hold on as much as possible, and he actually managed to do so at the end. And Alireza didn't really have too much of a chance. He just traded all the pieces, and they did not further play this game since both players just wanted to move on with the tiebreaks. So if Alireza won this game, he would have won the tournament clear first. But instead, we had a four-way tie between Fabiano Caruana, Gukesh, Alireza Firouzja, and Praggnanandhaa. So now let's move on and look at the tiebreak games. Since there was a four-way tie in the tiebreaks, players played a round robin of 10+5, where each player had 10 minutes and they got 5 seconds increment, and each player actually played against each other once with the designated color, and the color was chosen based on the final standings. Based on the current tiebreaks, the players had 4 different metrics. So first look game we're going to be looking at of the first tiebreaks. First round is Firouzja versus Praggnanandhaa. The game was in Italian, with a very sharp twist to it. Praggnanandhaa played g5, trying to really take the initiative with the black pieces. And very early on in the game here, Alireza spent roughly 5 minutes, so it was a very interesting way of managing his time. And he was already under some pressure right out of the opening, where Pragg really couldn't manage to capitalize. And here already both players, although it's move 16, had around 3 minutes, which is pretty low considering they are playing 10+5, so they spent a lot of their time already in the opening phase. So the game basically turned into a blitz matchup. Right about now, both players less than 1.5 minutes, they were playing a little too quickly at this point, and blunders were of course happening. It's a very natural part of the game, but this knight d4 move, I think one of the key moments of the game, trying to put the knight on f5, which was allowed, and the knights are actually doing great job. Now the bishop came from the corner, bishop b6, knight e6, another very impressive move by Firouzja, putting some pressure on Praggnanandhaa. Both players less than 20 seconds. They are really taking their time in this tiebreak, and it was looking all fine for Prague. But the game did not end in a draw as one would expect, because after this move b5, now this pawn on c6 was super weak, which white could have taken advantage of, but instead they decided to go for the weak black king. And this rook endgame eventually turned out to be winning for white, since the black king was extremely wide open, and eventually we got into a very simple rook 2 pawns, 2 connected pass pawns indeed, versus rook, which is a theoretical win for white, and Alireza simply went on to winning the first game, taking an early lead in the tiebreaks. So he demonstrated a very good technique. Although it took him some time, he was able to convert. Meanwhile, at the same time, Fabi was playing against Gukesh with the white pieces, so the game went off with c4 e5, d3 knight f6, and we had a reverse Scheveningen kind of structure, where white is essentially going for a reverse hedgehog pawn structure, and black is just simply developing his pieces as white would do against a Scheveningen or a Sicilian Khan type of position. So white goes knight e4, trying to get the bishop pair, but black did not give it up at this point. White goes knight c5, and finally, white was able to grab the bishop pair, rook d8, queen c2, bishop f5, hitting the pawn on d3, asking white whether they want to play the move e4 or place the knight on e4. Of course, white plays the move knight e4. This is a very typical idea. Let's try to put the knight on c5, so black had to give up the second bishop. So now, once again, we are seeing 2 bishops versus 2 knights, and 2 bishops are often more favorable, especially in open positions. White goes h3, queen e7, queen c2, queen e6, rook c1. And after a little bit of shuffling, white has a very dominant position, and there's not much Gukesh can unfortunately do. He kind of is shuffling and accepting that he can't really create counterplay, and Fabi was nicely and patiently just developing some breaks with his pieces. So he was calmly moving, putting pressure on the clock, and eventually, in this position now, Gukesh has less than 1 minute, whereas Fabi has 2.5 minutes, and he slowly went on to outplaying Gukesh with the bishops, since he's just able to shuffle and make Gukesh spend more time. White is once again shuffling, but now the a5 break comes into practice. So now black has 2 weak pawns, which will eventually fall. One has already been picked up. A little bit more moving around. And now white is up a pawn in entering into this complex endgame with queens on the board. Queen trade was offered. Technically speaking, this position should still be holdable for black, but with 9 seconds on the clock, this was a very difficult task for Gukesh, and eventually he collapsed under the pressure as more and more things started falling down. 1 more pawn fell down, and Fabi did a great job of winning this endgame. After the queen trade, he just simply picked up a 3rd pawn later on in this game, went on to winning the game. After putting the bishop on e8, the king has to go to h6 if he wants to defend this pawn, but after that the white king will just invade and that will be game over. So, after the first round of tiebreaks, we had Fabi and Alireza Firouzja tied for first. For the round 2 of the tiebreaks, we're going to start with the game Gukesh versus Praggnanandhaa. White started the game off with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and d3, a very calm approach. An approach to avoid theoretical battle by Gukesh. Both sides developing their pieces, and eventually, white started off, but then attack on the king side. After d5 e d5, queen f3 developing pieces, we eventually got a very interesting position, which looked like a dead draw, because the queens were off the board. We had a pure two bishop endgame, bishop pair versus bishop and knight endgame with pawns on both sides. It should be a dead draw, but some very interesting stuff happened at the time pressure moment. Around here, both sides have less than 15 seconds, so they're just blitzing out a bunch of moves. White is bringing his king, and then he brought his king and eventually played this move c4, and we had some very interesting fireworks. Bishop b3, c takes b5, perhaps the move b4 was possible, but it is very hard to evaluate this position in a real game. So Pragg basically took the pawn, and after c takes b5, white had separated pass pawns, split pass pawns we should say, that eventually managed to promote and helped Gukesh win a seemingly almost impossible endgame. But in a blitz game, anything is possible, and Gukesh was able to win. Although it was a rapid game, it almost turned into a blitz game, since both players had very little time, and Gukesh won, so he was 1 out of 2 at the tiebreaks. The most anticipated matchup of round 2 was between Fabiano Caruana and Firouzja, Alireza Firouzja, which started off with c4 e5 d3, bishop b4 check, knight d2, and c5, a very different approach we're seeing from Firouzja, and he had no trouble equalizing right out of the opening. We got a position like this, and here a very surprising blunder came by Firouzja. He played the move knight c6, attacking the bishop. Perhaps maybe he was a little less careful here, and the very strong move bishop to f6, temporarily sacrificing this bishop. After gf6 queen takes d5, Fabi had an absolutely winning position right out of the opening in 18 moves against Firouzja. But the fight just kept going. Firouzja didn't want to trade the queens, he wanted to keep them on the board, and started causing some problems, but at this point it almost looked like the game should just be over and Firouzja should resign, but no, the game had absolute fireworks happening. Queens were traded off the board now, but with very little time, and a passer that's potentially very dangerous on the A file, an outside pass pawn could always lead to some sort of trouble. So here, white is completely winning. Fabi is just simply improving his pieces, but both sides have again 15 seconds. So although this was a rapid game, almost all of the games went down to the wire, with players having less than 20 seconds, and under that time pressure, everything can go wrong if you are not careful. So completely winning position still. White should technically not have any problems up until this moment where Fabi played the move knight to f6, which was a big blunder. The winning move in this position was knight takes e5, getting rid of another pawn, and then winning the game eventually. But after knight f6, black was able to put the rook on h8, and then push the pawn to a3, and bringing in the king to g7, putting pressure on the h7 pawn. The knight went to h5 with check, king goes to f8, knight goes back to f6, because in this moment, black is threatening the move rook takes h7, because white will not be able to take that rook, due to the pawn going down, and becoming a queen on the next move. So that's why Fabi had to go knight back to f6, and we had some really exciting moments here. For example, the eval just went from equal to winning, and then very next move from winning to equal after the move king d4 is very difficult for the players to understand what's going on. But eventually we got this endgame, which is supposedly a draw, but Alireza was not able to understand white's idea. And after f5 he went rook to a6. In this position, both the moves g6 as well as knight d7 are winning for white. But at the first try, Fabi actually missed this. He played the move king g4, and he brought his king all the way to e7, to later realize that he needs to bring his king, and here he accumulated so much time. And unfortunately enough, Firouzja played the move rook a6 once again. The drawing move in this position would have been rook to c5, and white would not be able to make any progress if he found it, but he played a little bit too quickly at this point, and after knight d7 pawn went to f6, Fabi went on to winning the second game. And a very nice try for stalemate, but unfortunately this doesn't work because even if you give another check, the king steps on the f file and is winning. So therefore, Alireza had to resign at this point. Going into the final round of the tiebreaks, round 3, Firouzja was playing with the white pieces against Gukesh. So he started off with e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, cd4, knight d4, e5, knight b5, d6. We had a very sharp opening once again, and the reason for this sharp opening is that both players, at least one of them, wants to win, so that they can have a chance to catch up Fabi in case Fabi loses once again, as he did in the last round of the classical tournament, and they would have an Armageddon to decide the tournament, but none of, as we're going to see, that did not happen, but we still had some very exciting scenario happening in the final round. So in this position, just white is completely winning because Gukesh just went a little bit too aggressive with the black pieces, perhaps giving up a lot of his pieces, a lot of pawns, and Firouzja did not really have any trouble winning this position with white. So Firouzja went on to winning in a fairly easy fashion, and here Gukesh had to resign. And the final matchup that we're going to be seeing is Praggnanandhaa versus Fabiano Caruana. Prag, playing with the white pieces, wants to at least get one victory, and maybe make the tournament a little bit more exciting, and Fabi just needs the draw to secure the title. So we see a Trompolsky, another less debated theoretical battle. White goes f4, just trying to get some position, and white got a fairly interesting position out of the opening, as I would say this is somewhat strategically better position for white. But Fabi, he kept extremely calm in this position, and was able to hold on to the position. Eventually, in this moment, I guess white could have played the move h4, try to lock up the dark squares completely, and then perhaps later bring the knight to f4 to pick up this pawn later in the game. So knight h3 was played, allowing the pawn to go to h4. And white definitely had some slight pressure, but it did not lead to anything significant in the game, as we're going to be seeing soon. So white is trying to break with the g-pawn. He eventually does. Now he's gonna try to double up on the g-file if he has the chance with his pieces, but he did not get the chance. So Fabi picked up an extra pawn. The rook went inside, and trying to pick up more pawns. Rook c6. Rook went to h7, king goes to c4. The black king is very active now, creating a chaos, and the black bishop will find shelter on c2, and black picked up all the pawns. And eventually, instead of the game becoming a draw or a win for white, the very opposite happened. Fabi was able to have a comeback, and he won the game with the black pieces, securing the title after a very interesting round of tiebreaks. Although he did not manage to be able to win in the classical section of the tournament, he went on with 3 out of 3, a perfect score on the tiebreaks, winning him the tournament and giving us a very exciting final day at the recap. So yeah, this was a wonderful experience watching the final round of the Superbet Chess Classic Romania.
Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe.